Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session on our Data in Action webinar series. Before we get started, I'll just ask my colleague Mark just to move on to the next slide, just letting our Russian colleagues on this Zoom call know that there is Russian interpretation available. So at the bottom of your Zoom application, please select Russian and you will be able to hear our lovely interpreters interpreting our presentations through to Russian for you. So we move to the next slide then. So just a very warm welcome everyone to this Road Safety Capacity Building Program webinar series that has been brought to you by the Asia Pacific Road Safety Observatory and the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation CAREC program and the Asian Development Bank. So we're very grateful that the grant funding for this webinar series was received from the Japan Fund for Poverty Reduction, which is financed by the government of Japan through the Asian Development Bank. So a very warm welcome to everyone again. My name is Jessica Trung and I am from Lersninger, an organisation that specialises in Vision Zero planning, and I will be your host for the webinar today. So for those of you that have been joining us in the previous weeks, you'll know that this webinar series has been running for about a month and a half now. And the aim is to help engage a range of stakeholders to help them build capacity and understanding on how to apply the SAFE system and how to approach road safety and enhance data and policy decisions. So we're very happy to have you join us again today. And if we move to the next slide, so this is the fourth session out of the 5-session series. And today we'll be talking about developing KPIs and SPIs using the data that we've spoken about in our previous sessions. So joining us today in our webinar series is Dr. Johan Strandrud, who is from Lersninger. We also have Toru Kuchi from Itada and also Richard Owens from Agilices. So you will have the opportunity to hear from each of these speakers in turn today and learn a bit more about why key performance indicators are such an important part of your road safety interventions as you move forward with your country's road safety plans. So we move to the next slide, please. As we mentioned, this is series 1 of our webinar series, and we've had 3 other presentations earlier. We've heard a bit about the WHO status report, the history and the data that is contained within that. And in the second session, we heard a bit about all the other complementary data sources that can be used to assist you with your road safety efforts. In the last session, I talked a little bit about how to utilize all that data to help you with your strategy and action plan development. And in today's session, we'll hear a bit about how do you actually monitor the progress of your strategy rollout and development through the use of safety and key performance indicators. And then in 2 weeks' time, we hope you'll be able to join us for the very last webinar for this series, which will talk a bit about how do we engage stakeholders in our road safety plans and how do we finance our road safety actions. So we'll be very happy to have you join us at that very final sessions. And then there will be a next series that will be announced very soon, and we'll share the details of that in the coming days, and we hope you'll be able to join us for the webinar series too. So if we move to the next slide, please, Mark. Just before we get started on today's webinar, just a few very short housekeeping rules. You probably found out already that your microphone will be muted unless we invite you to speak. There is also a question and answer function in your Zoom application at the bottom. So we do encourage you to interact with this webinar and ask questions, and we will try to answer the questions as we go along, and all the speakers and anyone in the audience are welcome to answer the questions if you think you know the answer and contribute your thoughts to that. Otherwise, you can also use that function during our question and answer session at the end to interact with our speakers. So we do encourage you to do that. And of course, you can also raise your hand at the end as well if you wish to ask a question. So with that, I hope everyone enjoys the webinar today, and I am going to invite our very first keynote speaker, Dr. Johan Strandrud, to take the floor. He'll be talking a little bit about how do we actually develop key performance and safety performance indicators for in-country monitoring. So Dr. Johan Strandrud, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessica. I hope you can see my slides.
We can indeed. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good to be here in this webinar, and thanks for the opportunity to share some experience and thoughts about key performance indicators and safety performance indicators. And I think I'll just go to the next slide and mentioned a few of those names, because one thing is that we do have many names for this type of measuring tool. You've heard key performance indicators or KPIs, or safety performance indicators, SPIs, or maybe road safety performance targets, or target performance indicators, or performance measures. And we won't sort of stick to one as the absolute truth here, more to say that there's an array of different ways of naming these things, but we'll mostly talk about key performance indicator or safety performance indicators, at least in my presentation. But the gist of it all, or the actual purpose with all of this, is to try to better manage road safety, and the sort of underlying assumption that we cannot really manage what we cannot measure. So in order to manage road safety, we need to be better to measure road safety. We need to be better to measure success. We need to be better to measure what impact our actions have in road safety, to understand if we're on the right path, if we achieving our targets, and if we're not achieving our targets, what should we change in our approach, and what do we need to do differently, and what do we need to do more of? So going forward, we can see that understanding trauma trends, or trends in fatalities and serious injuries, is a very common way to understand if we're on the right path when it comes to road safety. And the decade of action and for road safety, and the initiative by WHO and the UN to halve the number of fatalities in that decade, and also in the next decades leading up to 2030, in understanding the progress towards those targets, understand where we are in terms of trauma trends, is of course essential, because ultimately it's about the people, it's about how people are affected, and how they are affected by low level of road safety in the system, and those risks in the system that essentially have an effect in the final outcome of serious injuries and fatalities. So there's no way around that we need to make progress in the absolute number of fatalities and absolute number of serious injuries. Otherwise, we can't say that we have good success in road safety. However, though, we need to sort of question whether or not fatalities and injuries is a good overall and only indicator when it comes to measuring road safety success. And that's sort of the underlying sort of purpose of today's session, is to say, is there any more or better ways of measuring success in road safety? So if we look at trauma trends, we can take Sweden as one example, but I haven't really put up the name of Sweden here because this is a very similar trend of fatalities as a lot of motorized countries and high-income countries that's had a spike in fatalities when there was a spike in sort of motorization, but then as road safety, the level of road safety in the countries increased, we see a downward trend. But as we see here, we can see that that downward trend has a set of mini trends, which means that you cannot really go into any particular year and say, this particular year is a very good indication on where we are when it comes to road safety. And if the actions that we've done in this particular year or the last year actually have had a good effect, because we have a long-term trend. We can see that we've had a long-term trend of increasing road safety or decreased number of fatality of around 3% per year in the last few decades, or actually several decades. But then there could be temporary increases due to external factors like economic variation or economic fluctuation, inflation, other things, which in a high level of economic growth actually pushes up fatalities and injuries, which, independent on your road safety actions, has an upward push on your fatalities. And we also have other spikes like this sort of seasonal trends, which is maybe more an expression of random variations in the trend of fatalities and injuries. So, and in addition to that, we know that official crash statistics can be incomplete in some countries. And again, that crashes and injuries are subject to external factors and random fluctuations. So these three trends, like the long-term trend, the medium trend, and seasonal variation plus random variation, can sometimes give that the variation of crashes and injuries is plus minus 30% for particular years. And that doesn't mean necessarily that we've succeeded or not been successful in our road safety actions in that particular year. So it becomes a bit difficult to measure our success only when it comes to total number of fatalities for a particular jurisdiction or country. Now you can of course get away with that by say that, well, we don't want to measure only the total number of fatalities for a country. We want to measure particular cohorts, and we want to measure particular groups of road users or different geographical areas, for example, to understand a bit more in detail how fatalities and injuries develop. So, for example, NHTSA in 2008 released traffic safety performance measures, which then broke down the total number of fatalities in a jurisdiction into these cohorts that we were talking about. So, for example, particular areas of interest at that particular point in time. We talk about unrestrained passenger in vehicle occupants, motorcycle operators, certain BAC levels, a number of speeding related fatalities, a number of unhelmeted motorcycle fatalities, pedestrian fatalities, etc. And this is, of course, one way of looking at more targeted cohorts and to understand if your measures and your actions have had a good impact in particular cohorts. However, again, also in these cohorts, we can have variation. And again, we know that fatalities and injuries can have a lag in terms of the effect that certain actions have on them, which means that there's quite a broad consensus on the fact that we should not only use fatalities and injuries as a measure. And if we go back to guidance on road safety management provided by the World Bank and GRSF, we can see in this target hierarchy that yes, on the top of that are our final results in terms of long-term goal for serious injuries and zero death. And below that, we have interim targets to sort of support those long-term targets. But then comes key performance objectives or key performance indicators that are related to these series and injuries. And they come as sort of a bridge or a connection between our interventions and the final outcome as serious injuries and fatalities. And that means that they are a good way to bridge our understanding between what we do and the effect that that has in serious injuries and fatalities. In relation to the global targets and the decade of action, the UN has set up a number of global road safety performance targets, yet another word. That is one way of trying to understand different areas on which we need to work in to achieve that target. So in order to achieve our targets to 2030, there is a number of underlying targets in different areas and different sort of pillars or components of the safe system, everything from roads to vehicles, enforcement, road user behavior, post-crash care, etc. So these targets are a good way to start to understand on what areas do we need to work in to achieve our long-term targets. If we don't have a clue on where we should start, this is a good way to start. And if we've covered these performance targets, we can be pretty confident that we're on a good path to understand that we're going to achieve our targets or that we're doing the right thing. And also the WHO report on road safety performance has now, as the first time, listed the UN voluntary target performance indicators, which is sort of a list of how many countries has actually sort of succeeded in signing up to these targets, and also more detailed have indicators relating to these targets. So on a global level, there is monitoring to try to understand how are we progressing towards the target, not only in terms of the fatality targets for 2030, but also how are we performing globally when it comes to signing up to these more voluntary performance targets. Now, this is all good, but it doesn't necessarily give us the necessary guidance for me in my jurisdiction to understand how do I develop my targets. Now, if I follow these targets, it'll set me up on a good path, and I know that I know that I'm doing good things. But in order to understand if I'm actually going to achieve my target to 2030, if I have a specific target for my specific jurisdiction, that of course needs to be linked to my specific trauma problem, to my specific context in my country. And in order to do that, it's not enough to just say that I'm going to adapt the global performance targets. I need to know that the indicators that I have in my jurisdiction actually relates to the trauma problem that I have in my jurisdiction and the vision for my country in what a safe transport system should look like. And that's where we're getting into sort of the second part of this presentation, which is more looking into the actual performance indicator development for a certain jurisdiction. So when it comes to key performance indicators, then they are really designed to understand the relationship between operation and FSI fatalities and serious injury reductions. They are there to trigger actions, to create accountability, to show what success looked like, and to identify change in the things that matters and focus on transformational changes to make sure that we're not just listing everything, and we're actually focusing on the things that makes a real difference. There is a quotation there that says that an indicator needs to be meaningful in that it can be used to inform or direct beneficial activity. So that is really the purpose, to guide stakeholders, to guide road safety partners to understand what to do yes, what to do really. So how do we develop these KPIs and SPIs? Well, there's a few different approaches. I've started with one, I should say, quite old UK examples. I'm sure there's more advanced way in the UK at the moment. I will hear about later, but this is sort of more an example showing one way where you don't have maybe access to all the data behind the performance indicators or the actual trauma, the connection between trauma and indicators. And that's the sort of consensus-based approach, which is quite common, where you pretty much take a number of experts, review literature, policy, international best practice. You go through a consensus group and an advisory panel to make sure that whatever is suggested based on this literature review and international best practice is based on also consensus with the relevant parties and the experts, and shortlist a number of key indicators depending on the suitability of these indicators. And normally you would also set up a number of criteria for selecting these key performance indicators, that there's a known relationship in literature between this KPI and the development of trauma, the accuracy and reliability of data, collection possible, like you actually can collect the data needed to understand this KPI nationally and locally, national relevance, legal requirements, and the need to cover different pillars or different components of the SAVE system, and also, of course, being pragmatic in terms of understanding the cost of collection, and rather context sensitive one, which was relating to the highway code in the UK. But this is one not bad way of looking at developing KPIs, which is pretty much taking the best knowledge that is out there and then making it as context sensitive as possible to your jurisdiction based on a set of criteria. Now, if you are able to do one step further, that would be normally preferable, and that would be to not only list a set of KPI based on international best practice, but actually try to understand in a systems perspective, how does these indicators work together to achieve the vision that I have in my country? Because if I list a number of KPIs and say they are all taking me in a good way towards a target, that's good, but it would be even better if I actually can say, well, if I have a certain target on each of these indicators and I can understand that the combined benefit of achieving all these targets for these KPIs is that I achieve my long-term and short-term targets. That's the sort of the best way of doing things, or the most analytically and empirically derived way of doing things. And that would be sort of going back to understanding how we develop a strategy in the first place. And that will sort of be a few slides that potentially Jessica shared with you the last session, but just to sort of understand where the KPIs are coming from. This is sort of one way of develop the KPIs that are based on the fact that we actually start with trying to understand what do we want our system to look like in a backcasting approach. What do we see in the future that the system that creates or that enables us to have zero fatalities and zero serious injuries, or at least close to it? What does that look like in terms of vehicle performance, enforcement, like road user behavior, infrastructure, etc.? And then we sort of move back from that to the present, understand the gap between the present and that future, and develop a strategy based on that. And from that strategy, we then develop our key performance indicators. So the first step in this process is to do sort of a baseline analysis. And this is sort of a very simplified conceptual picture of that. If we envision that we want to achieve 0 by 2050, for example, where do we start and where are we? And the first step is then to sort of do a business as usual forecast to understand if we continue as we are currently doing, where will that take us in terms of already funded infrastructure project, in terms of the current vehicle safety development, etc., etc. Of course, a bit of speculation, but still a good indication if that's going to take us close to 0 or not close to 0. Normally, it doesn't. And then try to understand what the target is, which in this case is 0, and just sort of state that the gap here is really what we want to close to achieve our targets. So that's a starting point. And just to show you a few examples then on how this can look like, a particular jurisdiction that's done then a certain baseline trend, but in this case, not all the way to 2050, but only to 2030, because this is then based on the aim to develop a strategy and an action plan for 2030 to achieve a particular target in 2030. So the first thing is to then say, well, if we include our already funded and committed initiatives and programs in infrastructure, vehicle safety, enforcement, policies for road user behavior, etc., we factor in sort of traffic growth and other things. Here is where we think that we'll end up, given the continuation of previous action plans and other actions that we have in our pipeline. Onto that, we will add additional interventions because we're not happy with this. This will only reduce fatalities with 15%. We want to aim to almost 50%. So we do a set of scenarios where we say that a new combination of interventions will actually take us to minus 44, 46, 56%. And based on this different scenarios, which comes from a certain combination of interventions, we can at least reasonably comfortably say that if we commit to this, we have a better chance of achieving this target. Now, this comes from a number of interventions, additional interventions, and all these interventions have a number of saved lives attached to them. And we will not go into the details of this in terms of trauma modeling and exactly how this is done, but just assume that there's sort of a process behind this that sort of estimate the number of saved lives for all these different initiatives. Now, if we then assume that these initiatives are saving lives, they are combined in a way that we achieve a certain target reductions, of course, then KPIs needs to be related to the fact that we're actually doing these interventions. So the next steps is then to understand how to develop the KPIs based on these interventions. So one example would be this, for example, which is a performance indicator then empirically derived from road safety strategy development. So this is a countermeasure that was listed in the previous page, which is full barriers on high-speed rural roads. We know how many kilometers of the proportion of the network that is covered today. We have a target by 2025, and we have a target by 2030 on a number of kilometers that needs to be implemented. And we also have a number of kilometers that needs to be implemented to achieve our end state in 2050. So we've defined that we want this to be 100% by 2050 to achieve our 0 target. And then we move backwards in the backcasting process to say, well, by 2030, that needs to be 1,000 kilometers to achieve that particular FSI reduction that we talked about to achieve our overall interim targets. And that could then be translated to the action plan, which is our project KPIs in what are we actually delivering. To perform this, we need to potentially take our top 20 high-risk roads, and we need to deliver a certain number of projects at a certain point in time to deliver this. And we can then translate that to our system state safety performance indicators, which is the proportion of travel or the proportion of kilometers that is covered on our high-speed roads with continuous barriers. So this is the connection between the strategy development, the initiatives, the project that we need to do, and the overall SPI that we use to understand and monitoring progress in our system, where we are, where we need to be long-term, and where we need to be short-term. That can also be done on a project basis, of course, where maybe on a more regional level, on a local government level, we want to understand that we're transforming a particular route. We have a target for that particular route, for that particular region or LGA, like local government, and we can monitor that in a way that makes us understand if we're heading towards targets or not. So that sort of gives us the components of what we can call a key performance indicator framework, where we had a number of things that needs to play together to actually make sense of this, where we won't cover everything that's needed in the input because we all know that we need our assets, our funds, people, management, etc. But that's another webinar. What we focus on in this KPI framework is that we have output indicators, which is what we talked about, the delivery of programs, projects that actually affects my safety performance indicators, which is our next level, which is our system state on the absolute most important transformational components in roads, vehicle, road user, speeds, post-crash care, the safe system, essentially, which in the next phase affects our final outcome in terms of fatalities and injuries, which could be expressed in the total number of fatalities and serious injuries, or the overall, or the cohorts of things. So next, a few examples, and towards the end of my presentation, how to develop targets. Just one example of how the outcome indicators can look like. This is an example from one jurisdiction where the overall outcome indicators is for fatalities, serious injuries reported by the police, but also MIS 3+ more severe injuries with a higher sort of a threat to life threshold, and some kind of indication of development over the last years. But also in the next table below, cohorts of people getting seriously injured or fatally injured in this case, or sort of seriously injured and fatally injured, so that we can understand certain areas of interest like rural roads, older vehicles, people that are more vulnerable, elderly, etc. But also maybe other cohorts, which for a particular strategy can be interesting, where we talk about fatalities involving high-risk behaviors or commercial traffic, etc. So these are our outcome indicators. And then we go to the next level, and we will look into this a little bit more in detail, where we actually talk about our safety performance indicators and the long-term and near-term targets. So again, this comes from an idea of what the safe system should look like, which is different in different countries. But we all have a set of indicators then, which we want to set to 100% fulfillment in that year when we want to achieve 0 fatalities and injuries. Now, we cannot guarantee that this will happen, of course, but based on best available evidence, we know that if we have our roads in good condition and in a safe state, we have our vehicles, and we have sort of road user policies and enforcement, we can at least reduce our current fatalities and injuries with about 90% with our current tools. So that is 100% by 2050. But the question is, how do we set targets for the near term by 2030 or 2025? And because that should be part of an indicator or KPI framework as well. So setting our KPI targets then could be based either on more a value-based approach, if I don't have all the analytics, or a more analytical approach. So if we start with setting KPI targets on a value-based approach, which is a name that I just made up, but I hope you understand the jigs of it, is to say that let's look at impaired drivers or non-impaired drivers when it comes to alcohol and drugs and fatigue. And we currently know where we are, the current level. How do we set the target for 2030? Well, one way would just be to say that, well, it seems reasonable to just halve the number of alcohol impaired drivers each decade to 2050. By 2050, it should be zero. We halve for each decade. Today, we have 99.89% sober drivers. If we go by the first principle, that would take us to 99.95% to 2030. Easy. Now, we can calculate what that means in number of reduced fatalities and serious injuries, and we set that as a particular target. We can choose to then do the same for drug, but we might say that, well, we want to have a stronger focus on preventing drug driving. So the target should be set a bit more ambitious to actually reduce in the first decade 75% of drug driving. So that's a more ambitious target. And then for fatigue, we can have a linear improvement to 2050. So this is more an approach which is set together with stakeholders to understand what measures do we have that can actually back this target up, what do we think is doable, what is reasonable, and where do we want to put our effort and ambitions. And there's a lot more that could be said about this, but sort of acknowledging shortage of time, we will move on and say you can also do like a little bit more of an analytical approach, which was a previous one that we talked about. So this is an example when it comes to road safety, infrastructure safety. So say that, well, the most optimal pathway, like the investment logic, would be to save as many lives as possible with road transformation in the decade to come, when sort of the safer vehicles that might take a few of these have not reached a significant fleet penetration. So we want to target high-risk roads in the first decades because we know it has a high potential, and we know that there's a lag in vehicle safety. So let's go and target those high-risk roads. So we want to sort of really target to have 100% safe divided roads in the action plan up to 2030. We want to make sure that we achieve at least 50% of VKT on high-speed undivided roads with barriers, and that equivalent to 500 kilometers. And for lower movement roads where we don't have the possibility to invest, we want to make sure we use speed management to achieve a certain percentage by 2030. And we can calculate the number of lives saved. So it's a combination of transformation, high investments where we have the most traffic, complemented with speed management where we don't have the same possibility to invest. And together that sort of makes us achieve our near-term target to 2030 in terms of number of lives saved, but it also takes us towards that long-term transformational path. And when we add this up, we can sort of do that in an example of a roads dashboard where we say, here's our dashboard to 2050 to 2025. Here's our different targets. Obviously, everything 100% by 2050. But to 2025, we need to take into account deliverability, economic investments, community acceptance, political environment, etc. All those things that are in a political environment and in a reality. And I'm sure that Rickard can show some nicer dashboards in the future, or and in the next presentation. This is more like a mock-up dashboard in that sense. I do want to mention also in this case that IRAP has an excellent dashboard online, which can be used to look at progress for different countries when it comes to infrastructure safety. So this is a live dashboard where you can go in particular countries. You can look at the trauma as a result of different shortcomings and gaps in infrastructure safety, but you can also click the KPI tab at the top of the page and see the progress for different road user categories, and the different aspects of road characteristics in your country. So this is one very good application when it comes to KPIs and the actual live KPIs for particular jurisdictions. Towards the end of the presentation, I do want to mention some challenges as well when it comes to KPIs. They are very, very useful tool, but it should not be seen as the only tool and the only way of measuring success. We should acknowledge that the system is complex. We cannot just say that absolutely, if I fulfill my KPIs, I can be 100% sure that I'm going to achieve a certain outcome. No, we know the world is complex. There's a lot of things we do in the background that's not normally expressed as KPIs, which we need to continue to do, that we need to continue to pursue. So we should be aware that we cannot just focus on the KPIs. That's not going to be a good outcome. Sometimes there's a conflict between accuracy and being pragmatic. Measuring everything down to the absolute last detail could be very resource heavy and very expensive. So you should consider, is it okay to measure things every second year, maybe every third year? Do I need to measure absolutely everything? Can I find a representative sample? What is actually most important to drive action? That is the main question. What is most important to measure and monitor to drive action in my jurisdiction? And of course, also in terms of target gaming, we know that sometimes people can be obsessed in just fulfilling one KPI instead of doing other things that we talked about, and that could be a danger as well. With my last 2 minutes, I'm just going to show some examples from Sweden before I finish off. And Sweden is one country that's done this since 2007 in a quite advanced way. And they have, every year they publish an analysis of road safety trends, including their KPIs, which is downloadable on their web page if you just Google this title. But they have a number of outcome indicators, in this case, fatalities, serious injuries as a result of pedestrian faults, also suicides and single bicycle crashes as well. So a number of outcome indicators. And then what they call system indicators, which is more than the actual safety performance indicators on roads, vehicles, etc. And just show one example, which is the proportion of high-speed roads with a median barrier, or the proportion of vehicles traveled, which in this case is almost 90%. You can see a map over Sweden, show the green part, which is where it is as it should be, and the red part is what is still to be made safe by either investing in high-level infrastructure or reducing speed limit. And there's a particular target to be 95% by 2030, progressing towards that target. Vehicle safety is another system indicator, which to the left, we can see the proportion of five-star vehicle in new car sales, which in this case is around 90%, 94%. And the goal is to be steady on that level, because you don't really want to be at 100%, because that would be a flaw in the system. But that is not very exciting to look at. So of course you want to also measure the progress and the implementation of new technology coming into the fleet. So the right-hand figure is the proportion of new cars equipped with certain safety technologies, and the forecast into the future and the target into the future. To be proactive, to understand what the current sort of actions are taking us to. There's also a number of performance indicators on which are called use, excuse me, indicators, which are then showing more indicators relating to safer road users or road user behaviors. So speed limit, compliance, sober traffic, bicyclists with helmets, etc., etc. Just one example of an indicator, again, not for you to see all the details, but to see the concept where there's a current level and there's a target and there's an understanding if we're tracking towards that target or not with sort of the current development. And of course, my final slide is then also to say that all these KPIs are good, but if they're just produced as a data set on the shelf in a lead agency, it's not very useful. So the best practice is, of course, also to make sure that this is communicated, this is followed up, this is being transparent, and because otherwise we're not really going to achieve the accountability that we want to have with these KPIs. They are there to drive action, they are there to create accountability, and to do that in a way, to do result conference and other public displays of this, be very transparent between your partners is a good way of getting towards that. So with that, I think I've used my 40 minutes, and I will say thank you and leave it to you, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Yuan, for that very comprehensive presentation on why we actually need key performance indicators and how we can use that to monitor and track our country's progress in achieving our road safety targets. And I think just like in the last session where we talked about target setting shouldn't just be about fatalities and serious injuries. In tracking our progress towards our targets, we also can't just rely on looking at fatalities and serious injuries. There are other measures within the system that we also need to look at in order to be able to build that system that we want to see in 2030 or 2050. So thank you very much, Yuan, for that lovely presentation. And, you know, he's given us a really good overview of why we need key performance indicators. And if I can just ask Mark, if you can please bring up the first poll question, it would be great to get an understanding from our audience, how many of you in your country and jurisdiction actually use key performance or safety performance indicators to monitor how your country is progressing in terms of road safety. If you can answer that poll question for us, that would be wonderful, and we'll come back with the answer after our next couple of presentations. With that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Toru Kuchi from ITADA, who will speak to us a little bit about how do we actually inform KPIs through crash data analysis. So thank you for joining us, Toru-san. The floor is yours. I think we can move to the next slide, please, Mark. Toru-san, you're on mute. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, JC. I'm Toru Kyuchi with the Japan. I briefly introduce Italy and its activity. Next, please. Today's agenda is shown here. Next, please. Next, please. This graph shows the change in road deaths. Note that in Japan, road deaths are defined as people involved in traffic accident who die within 24 hours. There are two peaks called the first and second traffic war, respectively. Italy was founded in 1992 during the second traffic war. Last year, there were 2,663 road deaths, only 15 fewer than the year before. Next, please. This figure showed one of the results of traffic accident in Japan. As you can see, it shows a reduction in road deaths from the peak in 1970. The number has decreased by 84%, and it is the smallest since the National Police Agency started keeping records. The Japanese government is proud of this great achievement. Next, please. Next, please. This shows the step to the establishment. In 1988, road deaths exceed 10,000 again. 1989, government declared a state of emergency to fight road deaths. In 1919, Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association supported the establishment of the organization. In March 1992, government permitted the establishment. And finally, in June 1992, Italy was designated as the Seoul Center based on Road Traffic Act. And next, please. Here's the main purpose of Italy. For effective measures against traffic accident, Italy conduct scientific investigation and analysis. Various ministries and agencies provide necessary data to Italy. Using them, Italy conduct detailed investigation on individual cases. Italy broadly feed back the outcomes of these investigation, analysis, and research. This helps to reduce traffic accident or mitigate damage. Next, please. Next, let's look at our financial situation. At the time Italy was founded, we received funds from many organizations and companies involved in the transportation. But the government did not pay a cent. The base fund was about 8 billion yen, and the largest part was paid by JAMA, followed by the General Insurance Association of Japan. Ordinary income was about 851 million yen in fiscal year 2023. The main sources of income result from the investigating the base fund, investing the base fund, the revenue from the contract research for the government or the other organization, and the sales of accident data. We receive no subsidy from the government directly. Next, please. This chart shows the basic flow of collecting the traffic accident data. In Japan, if people are involved in the traffic accident, they must notify the local police by law. The local police dispatch an investigation team to the site. In case of injury, the investigation team input data based on the data collection coding form. The prefectural police collect all data from local police and then send them to the National Police Agency periodically. Italy receives the data of fatality and injury from the National Police Agency. Next, please. As a coding home controlled by the National Police Agency. Depending on the accident, the forms are also used by investigation police officials. Considering the traffic situation, coding items are revised periodically, usually once every 5 years. Recently, e-scooter items were added every year. Next, please. In addition to traffic accident macro data, ITARDA collects various macro data from ministry. The NPA also possesses driver's license data, including traffic violation record. Namely, has vehicle registration data and road census data. These are the kind of macro data that can be connected with traffic accident data. Next, please. Summarize data. Regarding data macro, ITARDA use several high-quality data provided by official organizations. The integration of database expands the scope of analysis. Regarding data micro, ITARDA is the first center to work on micro investigation of traffic accident in Japan. Investigation from human, vehicle, and road environment viewpoint are conducted. Next, please. Data macro and data micro are our two views of traffic accident data. Regarding data micro, we have general micro by Tsukuba office and specific micro by Tokyo office. Next, please. Some specific micro examples are shown below. On the left, a commercial vehicle serious accident investigation. The photo is of a ski coach accident on Usui bypass in Nagano. In the middle, decoordinate accident investigation. The photo is on the dashcam image of a success-free case in Hokkaido. On the right, automatic vehicle accident investigation. A new investigation group has been established to handle automatic vehicle accidents. Next, please. We showed some example for the data. This slide, next, please. This slide shows the number of the rear-end collision according to two configuration. Upper graph shows the case where the other car was moving forward. The lower graph shows the case where the other car was stopped. Comparing the two, the upper red curve shows the significant decrease in the number of collisions since 2012. The decrease was due to the increasing of AEB, but this is also shown in the GNCAP test, which indicates that collision could be avoided if the other car is moving forward, but not if the other car is stopped. Next, please. The 2016 and 2017 JTAT macro was used to reveal AEB effectiveness. Number of rear-end collisions were 50 to 60% lower with AEB for all vehicle models. Difference in effectiveness between vehicle models were not clear. Next, please. The effect was compared between daytime and nighttime. Nighttime was found to be less effective. Next, please. The slide shows the decoordinate issue and outline of the system. The collision occurred, the airbag deployed, vehicle data recorded in EDR were sent to the answering point, where the algorithm estimate the level of occupant injury. The result was sent to the fire department and the emergency hospital simultaneously. Next, please. From the dashcam video of the vehicle with the decoordinate, two images were shown here. 200 milliseconds before collision and just before the collision. Next, please. Last one is in-depth investigation results shown. Unfortunately, K-car driver was a CPA on the scene. Then passenger car equipped with decoordinate driver received a prompt treatment by the flight doctor on the scene and was transported by the air ambulance to the emergency hospital. In this case, the system worked extremely successfully and saved the driver's life. Next, please. Thank you for kind attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Toru-san. And there was a question in the chat group earlier that asked about, well, how do we actually measure fatigue-related crashes? How do we actually be able to track that? And I actually think Toru-san's presentation actually indicated through crash data analysis and in-depth accident studies like this, we can actually find out some of the contributing factors to a lot of the fatalities and serious injuries that we're sort of seeing on our roads. So this is a good example of how we can use some of this information to help us develop our KPIs as well as track its progress. So thank you very much for that, Toru-san. Great. Mark, can you please bring up the results of our first poll question? So just to see, lovely music playing in the background. Excellent. So out of our participants, we're seeing about half of our participants actually using KPIs and SPIs to track progress, and then about half that doesn't currently do that. So that's really interesting. Going back to what Yuan was saying in his presentation, that we can't actually measure what we cannot, we can't actually track what we don't measure, something like that. I'm sure I actually got the wording wrong, but pretty much going back to, if we don't actually track our progress, we don't actually know how we're doing. So this is something that is, I guess, something for a lot of the countries that aren't currently doing that we're going to have to think a bit about how to progress that. So we can come back to this in our question and answer session. So thank you for that, Mark. And with that, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Mr. Richard Owens from Agilicis, to also provide his perspective on how we can use data to inform our KPI development. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Jess. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody who's tuned into this webinar today. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about safety performance indicators. Within the UK, you've seen some examples of the thinking that's been going on around safety performance indicators, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience with the use of novel data to monitor safety performance indicators. So you've already heard a lot about safety performance indicators, so I won't go into too many details on that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a project that we've been involved in over the last 15 months with a number of other key people, and this is for an Asian Development Bank funded project. So myself as project leader, Wouter van der Berger, who's a road safety performance specialist, incredibly experienced in safety performance indicators in Europe. And Felix Wilhelm Siebert, who's an expert in safety performance indicators relating to motorcycles. So our project, and this is the first time that we've actually done any kind of presentation on this, so this is definitely a bit of an exclusive here. We're not complete on the project yet, but I thought it'd be really good to give you some examples of what we've been doing. Our aim here is to look at 3 different safety performance indicators. The first one is around monitoring where within a country 75% of travel happens. I'm not going to talk too much about that one today. Mainly focus on the second 2 here, which are around the proportion of vehicles traveling over the speed limit and the proportion of two-wheeler users wearing helmets on the traffic network. So, a little bit about the project aims in here. We're looking at where data might be available across APRSO countries. There's a big lack of information about ground truth data to validate novel data sources. So we've been trying to have a look at that too. And we recognise that, in the global north, safety performance indicators, KPIs, much more likely to be measured. But even then, they still rely on a lot of traditional survey methodologies. So we've got 3 distinct phases of the project. We're actually into the full data collection phase at the moment, with results coming out in this summer. And they're linked very much to 2 of those safety performance targets that Johan was mentioning earlier. So target 4 and target 6.
Sorry, Richard, can I just ask you to slow down a little bit for our interpreters, please?
Okay. So in terms of the methodology report, we have produced a full 97-page report within this. So this is going to be one of the key outputs, again, launching this summer. And this reviews a lot of the information that's been collected from Europe, but also other countries, looking at data sources and methodologies, different technologies, and initial assessment of suitable target countries where this might be rolled out globally. Within that report, we carried out an analysis of SPIs and their use in other countries. So, for example, if you have a look at Europe, you can see that not all countries monitor all safety performance indicators, but you can see at the top there the ones around speeding and the ones around helmet use for cyclists as well as powered two-wheelers, so motorcyclists, are the most commonly recorded ones. But you can see some of the ones at the bottom, even around road infrastructure, not commonly recorded in some high-income countries. So it really does illustrate challenges in countries that may not be at those higher income levels. In terms of speeding safety performance indicators, what I wanted to show here were two different charts, again, that we analysed from Europe. On the bottom left-hand side, you can see how the speed performance indicator is shown. So you can see that it is measured in terms of speed compliance. So ideally, you want to be higher up that chart. And you can see within the countries, sometimes they break those down into motorways, into rural roads, urban roads, and then expressways, where that's a classification within an individual country. But you can also show average speeds. So this is the bonus that you get out of the same kinds of information. You can then have a look at the average speeds. And the compliance relies very much on the speed limit data. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. One of the complications around the speeding SPI is that speeds are not uniform throughout the day. And this poses challenges for us in terms of how we want to measure speed. So on that chart on the left-hand side, the light blue bar, light blue line shows the amount of traffic on an individual road section, and the dark blue line shows the amount of speed. So you can see that there is that inverse relationship between traffic and speed. As traffic increases, speed reduces. So you need to think very carefully about what kind of speed measures you use within your analysis, because we know that congested traffic tends to be traveling at a much lower speed, but might not necessarily reflect the true intentions of drivers. There's lots and lots of data and different ways that you can collect information on speed. Here are quite a few examples coming up. We've included a full review of all of these within the report that comes out later this year. Lots of different technologies, from using radar, from using loops, tubes, lasers, lots of traditional roadside mechanisms, but then also other novel data sources, including using mobile phone data, GPS, even community-based video imaging systems. That's the one at the top there. So that's a sensor that anybody can buy and attach to a window, and it does AI-related traffic counts and speeds, but then also using Earth observation satellite data. And that's something that we have significant experience of in Africa, for example. So that's enough about speed and the information that we found out there. What about helmet wearing? Almost every single approach that we see uses observational surveys. People stood by the side of the road on a small number of sites, just having a look and seeing what compliance looks like. That's a perfectly legitimate approach. It doesn't give you good coverage nationally, but if you set up your sample sizes, it can be more than sufficient. We tend to see that there's lower compliance for pillion passengers and also lower compliance in rural areas just from this kinds of data. But there are novel techniques available using AI. So you can see in the image here, this is from a training database where you take an image of a road and then you train it so that it understands what motorcyclists look like, so it can identify motorcyclists, and then what helmet wearing looks like. And this is something that our project team has been working on over the last 5 years. And I've already used it to produce some reports. So this isn't, future AI technology. This is something that has already been proven. So here's just some examples from previous research. You can see that you can create maps on the right-hand side, which look at helmet wearing rates. On the chart at the bottom, you can see what helmet wearing rates look like over time and comparing two different areas. And then in the top, what it's doing is it's comparing the AI approach with the human, visual technique. So I'll just move on quickly from this data demonstration slide, just to say that we have been testing this out in various different countries and finding the strengths and weaknesses. One of the biggest weaknesses that we find, and I think this really is a strategic issue for road safety, is the lack of good quality speed limit information. Here's an example from Chiang Mai in Thailand. On the left-hand side, you can see the quality of the open data. So very patchy and very missing. But on the right-hand side, you can see the kind of quality and coverage that you get from commercial data. This is something that many countries in Europe are striving to have as available as open data for the whole of the road network. Moving on a little bit in terms of the results that we can get from some of the connected vehicle data that we used, you can see that on individual road sections, you can quite readily pull out that information about traffic speeds. But then in order to create the safety performance indicator, you need to relate it back to the speed limit, which of course requires that the speed limit is set with safe system principles in mind. Going back to helmet wearing, we had an enormous amount of success detecting, almost well over 10 million images within the data, and started to look at quite significant coverage along individual road networks. And from that, we're able to produce some interim results. So, here's some examples of what helmet wearing using that AI approach might look like in these 3 different countries and regions. And then we can then take that further, repeat some of the analysis that looks at what helmet wearing looks like over time. So you can see, the amount of information that we have available within the database. In terms of road coverage, we want to make sure that we're covering as much of the road network as possible within this approach, rather than looking at individual locations. This is the benefit of these AI large-scale approaches, looking to cover around 65,000 kilometers of road that break down into these individual road classes, but also breaking it down into rural and urban, because we want to see what the differences look like within individual areas, because this can help road authorities target what the issue is. So just my last slide now. This is just a sneak preview into the kinds of data that we're now able to provide. So one of the outputs for this is going to be a dashboard that will be produced nationally, and it will show information not only about the whole country, regions, as well as road classes, but also about individual road sections. So you can see this individual road section in Thailand that we sampled here. We've got over 1.4 million vehicles that were used in the sample here. And you can see that the speed performance safety indicator there is 77.5%. And that had an average speed of nearly 70 kilometers an hour. And just for context, this is what that individual road looks like. Now, it's up for debate whether this is a safe speed on this individual road. I would normally expect this to be a little bit lower if it was within the UK. So I think that's one of the key findings that we have out of this, that we need to make sure that we have safe speeds set in our individual countries. So there's a summary of where we are at the moment and where we're going to be in the future, and I'm looking forward to hopefully updating many of you in the future on this.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was a really interesting presentation and a really good example of the types of data collection and KPI development that we can do in low middle income countries. So thank you very much for that example. So now this is an opportunity for everyone to get involved in the conversation. So please do utilize the question and answer function to put down any questions that you would like to pose to each of our speakers. So now I'd like to invite all three speakers to come back and we will do a bit of a question and answer session. But before I throw some questions out to the panel, Mark, can we please bring up the next poll question? So we've heard a bit about the different types of data that we can collect and also, the different types of KPIs that we can use to monitor our country's progress. It'll be really interesting for us to get an understanding of what type of indicator are you using for your country or your jurisdiction. So if you can please input your answer to that poll question, that would be very much appreciated. So now please do put your questions in the question and answer function or raise your hand if you do want to ask a question of one of our speakers. So there's been a wealth of information that's been shared in this webinar now, and many of our participants in this webinar are from low middle income countries where we've been told that data availability is often quite limited. So maybe my first question for you, Yuan, is with KPI development, are we able to do that with quite limited data? Thinking about regions where data collection might be quite limited, how can they develop KPIs to monitor their country's progress?
Well, I think to start with, the area with KPIs, it is a data hungry one. I mean, there's no question that to make sense of sort of key performance indicators and understand, we need data. But having said that, it's not that we need a complete KPI framework to start with. So I think a country that doesn't have anything, start with the basics. And sometimes it could be even like sometimes we think that we need to start with understanding trauma data to understand KPIs, and that's not necessarily true because we struggle a lot with understanding just basic level of fatalities and injuries in a country. And instead of sort of struggling with that before we go to the KPIs, start with the KPIs in parallel, because Rika just shows that maybe with some new innovative methods, it could be even easier to monitor and track some basic KPIs instead of having absolute accuracy in trauma data. So start with the basics. The other thing would be go to what's currently available for global KPIs. If we do what's listed in those performance targets by the UN, of course, it will take us in the right direction. So for anyone asking, what should I do? Well, that's a good list to start with, to just understand what's good measures in terms of achieving targets. The other option would be to use what's internationally available from institutions like IRAP or NCAP, where they actually have on country level broken down indications of vehicles and infrastructure, etc. So utilize what's already available. And then I can't help but pass to Richard as well, or Richard, when it comes to new innovative data collections, where things that we saw before was very expensive and resource hungry, not at all adapted for low middle income countries, today are actually quite achievable, or hopefully at least in the near future, quite achievable with the help of funding sources, etc., to develop for low middle income countries. So, yes.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Yuan. And that is a good segue to a question for Richard, because I think there's a lot of interest in that AI data collection tool that you mentioned in your presentation. I'm interested in how easily accessible that is for low middle income countries. And there's also a question in the chat regarding how much does it cost to actually utilize?
Yeah. How much does it cost is a big question. Look, within this project, we've tried to look at open data sources as much as possible, recognizing that countries aren't going to want to spend six-figure sums, maybe even seven-figure sums on purchasing data for entire countries. We've tried to do it in a different way to many other people in that we're looking at sampling approaches. A lot of this project has been GIS based, has been looking at how you can randomly sample on road sections. So you would only need to purchase 5 or 10% of the data for the network rather than 100% and get the same kind of result out of it. So yeah, I can't necessarily put a figure on it, but what we're definitely trying to do is to make sure that we create and publish methodologies that may be repeatable, not necessarily by ourselves, but repeatable by other people, and consistent across different countries as well, across different countries and across time, so that people can definitely compare their performance.
Great. Just a very quick follow-up question then, Richard. How well does that AI tool actually be able to detect proper use, like properly fastened helmets and like, good fit and all that?
That would be fantastic. I mean, there's different helmet types that we'd like to be detecting first of all. Of course, your full face helmets versus the non-full face versions. Detecting whether it is strapped in would require some really high resolution imagery. What we've been using is open data from the Mapillary platform, using that free of charge under license. We have been evaluating commercial data, which would be 4K panoramic resolution imagery. But yeah, maybe that one's a little bit further down the line.
Yes, but let's not forget what Yuan was saying about let's not let the best be the enemy of the good. Like having a tool like this and being able to measure helmet wearing in the first instance is already a very good start. So as technology gets better, we can then start looking at these other indicators as well. Fantastic. Toru-san, you talked about in your presentation a number of different data collection methods and data that you do collect. How is that being used by your government for road safety planning and KPI development? You're on mute, Toru-san. Still on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Regarding AB, detailed analysis action data and published result, and the data revealed the effectiveness of AB in nationwide. In response to these results, the Emirates has mandated the new domestically produced vehicle be equipped with AB starting in November 2021. Of course, the AB mandate was partly due to the fact that it was mature in terms of social acceptability. Subsequently, new imported vehicle will be required in July 2024, and continuing protect the vehicle will also, or maybe mandated soon. But with the further increase in the number of AB equipment vehicles, it would also consider it necessary to conduct a new effectiveness evaluation. On the other hand, and the reconnect issue, the government issued a traffic safety master plan every 5 years. From 2006, the emergency notification system was already mentioned. After the 2 decades, Emirates issued this system. And now government will be preparing the next plan in 2026. Automatic accident notification system will be mentioned, and moreover, advanced automatic accident notification system like Reconnect might be mentioned. Furthermore, based on the result of the data effectiveness evaluation, Reconnect is likely to become mandatory for new vehicle in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Toru-san. Excellent. Mark, can I please ask you to bring up the results of the second poll around which indicators our participants are using to monitor their country's progress? So I think, as expected, most countries are using fatalities and serious injuries as the key measure of how their country is progressing. And then about a third, there's no progress monitoring at all. And then there's about 30% that's using both indicators for different aspects of road safety and FSI. So that's really interesting. Maybe I'll just throw it to the panel. Any thoughts on these poll results? Is that surprising to you that countries are using these types of indicators? Any advice that you'd like to provide? Any thoughts? Maybe Yuan, I'll throw it to you first.
Yeah, I can start. I think it's no surprise to me. I think this is what we see globally in terms of what countries are normally monitoring. And I would say that, again, encouraging countries that are only measuring success in fatalities and injuries, that it's so much better guidance for all partners if we can actually connect the strategy development process into also development of KPIs. I think that's one of the sort of advice that I would give as when we develop a strategy, the process of develop a strategy should also be the process of developing KPIs, so that out from a strategy and action plan comes a full set of KPIs, so that we already, when we start the implementation and delivery of an action plan or any kind of sort of interventions towards achieving a target, we should have those KPIs ready to go. So yes, that would be sort of one advice. Another one would be that if you don't have KPIs, at least try to measure serious injuries and fatalities into cohorts and other type of targeted groups. If you are providing, if you, for example, are implementing a speed monitoring or a speed management program in urban areas, well, maybe next year you should follow up for the next 5 years fatalities and injuries just in urban areas in those speed limits to see if you have some targeted effects there. So there's way to target and to be smart with what you have available as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Yuan. Richard, Toru-san, any quick comments?
Yep, just briefly on that one. I think introducing safety performance indicators and linking them with casualty data, it's something that has been talked about for a good number of years, but with a few exceptions, it hasn't always been delivered successfully, even in high-income countries. So one thing that I would suggest, exactly as you were just saying there, Johan, just make sure that you focus on the most important ones, the ones that it's the biggest road safety priority, the ones that you have the tools to influence, and the ones that you can collect reliable and accurate data for. And as somebody who's been working, in speed-related policy for a long time, I'd always recommend, using that as the real starting point, and then work out from that, because we know that the speed of vehicles has just such a massive impact on road safety performance.
Great, thank you, Richard. Toru-san, any last comments?
Not special comment is not English, but today I have great honor to join this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And with that, I would like to thank our fantastic speakers, Toru-san, Richard, and Yuan, for joining us today as we start to wrap up our session. Now, Mark, can I please ask you to bring up poll number 3? It would be very helpful for us to understand what you found most helpful in today's session, which would then help us inform webinar series 2. If you don't mind completing poll question number 3, that would be fantastic. So once again, I want to thank Richard, Yuan, and Toru-san for taking the time to prepare the presentation and sharing with us your thoughts on KPI development. Thank you very much. Now, Mark, if we can just bring up the last few slides. There's been a number of questions and comments regarding where you can find the presentations from today and from the previous sessions. They are all available on the Road Safety Capacity Building Programs website, the APRSO Knowledge Hub, and the website is there. So you can access all the materials from there. And then next slide, please, Mark. And then for the very final webinar of this series 1, we'll be talking about stakeholder engagement and how to finance our road safety strategies. So that's happening in 2 weeks' time, and we would highly encourage everybody to come and join us for this very last webinar for this series. But as mentioned earlier, webinar series 2 will be announced very shortly, and we will be sharing more details around that series in the coming days. So once again, I want to thank everyone, including our speakers, for joining us on this webinar today. I wish you a good day, good evening, or a good night, depending on where you are in the world, and have a lovely week. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.